Okay, welcome back. We are going on to chapter 20, and then will be chapter 21, which make up unit 6. So we're going to move on to talking about several different topics that are going to span these two chapters. This one is going to talk about energy flow through the ecosystems, and we'll introduce what a food chain is and a food web, and how energy just moves throughout different things. So first off, remind yourself, what is an ecosystem? It's just a community of living and non-living things, so the abiotic factors. And it's going to be both the living and the non-living in a geographic area. Now, we study how the nutrients and energy are stored and move between the organisms, the atmosphere, the soil, and the water. On the next lecture, you're going to see there's going to be what we have our biogeochemical cycles of how carbon and phosphorus and sulfur are all interchange between the organisms, the atmosphere, the water. Now, within this, we know that organisms compete for food, water, sunlight, and space. That is something we have to go through and respect in each of these different ecosystems. Now, I'm going to have a different lecture for these. There's 3 categories of ecosystem. We have our freshwater and our marine, which I'll put in one lecture, and then the terrestrial. Now, within the terrestrial, we'll kind of break it up into what we call biomes, which are going to be different things based off the area and unique qualities of them. So here's a little bit more about the broad overview of our ecosystem. So the first one was your freshwater. So you have about 1.8% of the Earth's surface is just composed of fresh water. This is going to use your lakes, your rivers, your streams, and your springs. And there is a lot of life that actually depends on this and lives in this and uses it for many things, including a lot of fish, your amphibians, reptiles, insects, fungi, and quite a lot of bacteria. Now, what's surprising, about 75% of the Earth's surface is actually marine or covered in salt water. We're going to go over the different types, but there's 3 main types. You're going to have the shallow ocean, which is going to be the coral reef ecosystem, which is going to be the most diverse. You have deep ocean water, which is more of the open part, and then you have the deep ocean bottom, which we don't know a lot about because it's kind of hard to get there. What I find fascinating and do appreciate that 40% of all photosynthesis on Earth is actually performed in the oceans by phytoplankton, so those really small guys you can't see. I always tell y'all good things to watch. I love this documentary. It's on Fire and Ice. It's on HBO. And it actually talked about different ways that we are battling these rising CO2 levels, and the use of oceans was actually talked about on it. I found it quite interesting. Now we're going to talk about the different terrestrial ecosystems, and we're going to break them up into what we call biomes, which are these large communities. And like as I mentioned, they're going to be defined by plants, the region, the climate. And these are just some examples that you're going to see on that lecture. Now, ecosystems have to be able to adapt because things are constantly changing. It can be due to human, it could be due to natural disasters. There's all kinds of stuff out there. Now, with disturbances, sometimes the natural ones like fires and earthquakes, floods, hurricanes, drought, what we need to see is how does the ecosystem adapt and can it rebound from it? We also have to consider all the human activities. What does agriculture, air pollution, oil spills do to those? And especially oil spills when you think about the oceanic ecosystems. Now, with an ecosystem, it kind of has this equilibrium it likes to be at, where there's like changes in species and numbers, but the diversity remains pretty much constant. You know, there's going to be a flux, a give and take, but you're still going to remain about the same biodiversity numbers. So we like to measure things by resistance and resilience. Now, resistance is how it can maintain equilibrium even with disturbances. So you want a high resistance. And resilience is the speed at which it recovers following that disturbance. So you want it to be able to recover pretty fast too. So this last part of this section kind of talks about food chains and food webs because everything really is linked together. I always think about the Lion King and they always talk about the circle of life. So when it comes to a food chain, it's just a linear way to show how organisms and nutrients is passed through one to another. So it's normally shown on this pyramid right here, and then you're going to have energy shown in trophic levels. And depending on the type of organism you are and what you consume will determine what trophic level you fall on. Now, one thing I want to point out is energy is going to be lost in each trophic level. So it's also going to be lost, and we have the decomposers that play a key role in the environment too, because they recycle nutrients, which are then utilized by primary producers. So everything comes back to the bottom right here. So the sun's energy is going to go through and help with our primary producers. They're the ones that primary use that. So they're the ones that carry out photosynthesis. So think of all the plants out there, all right? The next level up is your primary consumers. So these are going to primarily eat the plants. So these are most likely going to be your herbivores. Your secondary consumers, next up on the level, are going to be primarily eating the primary consumers. Now, I'm not saying they can't go back and eat some of the primary producers, but most of the time when you look at this, the diet is normally from the level right below. And then we have the tertiary consumers, which eat secondary consumers, and finally get to the apex, which is the top level predators. So one thing you should notice is as you go through each level, the energy level keeps getting less. So you're going to have to eat more to get more energy, depending on where you fall on this trophic pyramid. Now that's one way to show things, but a food web is actually more, I think, accurate. Now this is basically a graphic representation of all the primary producers, consumers, and higher level consumers within a place. Now all these interactions are shown, and because some of things eat more than just like one type of food. They might eat both plants and animals, depending on type of food it is. Now, you can notice with these, you have different levels. I like this one because it is color-coded. So they have your primary producers outlined in green right here. Your primary consumers are outlined in orange, secondary in blue, and tertiary apex are going to be in purple. So you can see like how these different things feed into the different levels on the food web, but everything is pretty much overlinked right here, because you can see the shrimp also comes down to this level right here, and then he is a food source for all these fish right here, and it's all kind of linked together. Now there are different types of food webs. We have your grazing one, where you have your herbivores, your carnivores, and your photosynthetic organisms. And then the detritus is where we put decomposers at the bottom. So there's like a level below it that we are not showing, because the decomposers break down nutrients into smaller components that are then used by our primary ones to kind of contribute to the next level. So why do we talk about this? Well, everything is linked. We all need energy, and remember the currency we use is called ATP. Now there's different ways that we're going to get it. Autotrophs, which we identify as self-feeders, make their own food. So these can be, think of phototrophs. Remember we talked about photosynthesis. So they're able to take sunlight and convert carbon dioxide into sugar that they can use. You'll see this most likely in plants, algae, and some bacteria. Now, the one thing that we can measure is the gross primary productivity. That's the rate at which photosynthesizers trap energy from the sun. You want this number high. And then another thing we can measure is the net primary productivity, and this is the energy that remains in producers after accounting their respiration and heat loss. So it does take a little bit of energy to make energy. And whatever is left is what's going to be consumed by the primary consumers. Now, photoautotrophs use the sun. We also have chemoautotrophs, which use inorganic molecules as a source of energy. Your prokaryotes are really going to utilize this, and they use it when sunlight's not available. So these are going to be your prokaryotes that survive in really harsh environments. Now, the one thing that with the food webs, it can be beneficial, but there are consequences. And one thing that this book does talk about is biological magnification. So this is when we start to see toxins or chemicals become concentrated as they pass through a food chain. So the example shown on here is mercury. So mercury, we have all this waste exhumed into the atmosphere. It does go into the water. The smaller organisms eat it. Now they start to eat, and the bigger organism eats that, and we're going to start to acquire more and more amounts of mercury. So by the time we start to eat one, we are consuming all the mercury. All the previous organisms start to do that. So we start to see that in like fat It's most likely stored in the fat in previous organisms. We've seen it problems when it comes to DDT pesticide. We've seen that affect the shells of the bald eagle. And these PCBs, this has really been a big one they've been pushing lately. And then heavy metals. That's why they tell pregnant women to avoid seafood. If you're concerned about heavy metals, this is a link to an article talking about heavy metal in food. So as usual, here's your review videos and credit for the sources.